farm that homesteads as well as farms, but our three primary enterprises here are pastured poultry, so meat chickens, and we have pastured eggmobiles producing eggs, and a no-dig market garden. This farm is half forestry and half pasture. So we run market gardens on 1,500 square meters. We run about 1,200 laying hens typically, and 4,000 or 5,000 meat chickens in a year. So a small, mixed, diverse farm where we can start to close nutrient cycles and also provide a full human diet, which has been really important to us. Well, I went to agriculture school when I was 18 to study organic horticulture and crop production in the UK at agriculture school there. And I left there with a lot more questions than answers. So I embarked on a longer global trip looking for people that had different solutions. It took quite some years to find really working examples, and I found it very hard to find people willing to share data, like numbers and facts and figures. And so that's become a key part of this farm, is creating a place that shares the sort of data that I wish I had had access to when I was learning. Starting a farming business is perhaps the hardest thing you could do. A lot of young people coming into this kind of business, they're growing up in a world that missed a bunch from a few generations ago. We really wanted to create a space that was open to people to come and get engaged. So we've tended towards running really long-term farmer training, and quite hardcore, you know, more like farm boot camp. So we really focus on choosing enterprises here that A, are symbiotic, but B, are things that people can come and really learn about tangibly here, get enough experience to then confidently go away and set up according to their own context in their own country. So we're farming up here at 59 degrees north, so in the summer months the season comes very quickly. Spring and autumn are very short, and it quickly transitions from dark, cold winter to highest summer, and then it's quickly winter again. So frost-free dates here would be like 6th of June is safe, and 15th of September that frost is coming back, and that could move a few weeks either direction. So it's a fast and furious growing season here. So we work long hours in the summer, but we're also complemented with 6 months of basically me here for 1 hour a day, you know, collecting eggs, feeding cattle, and that's my workload. We get up at 6 o'clock, got to open the eggmobiles, and they start laying eggs at 6 o'clock because the sun's been up since 4. We move the cows and sheep who cut the grass in front of the eggmobiles, and we time their interactions so that they receive all the fly larvae from the cow manure and follow them around the pasture like that. Then we move all the broiler chickens, and that's quite a big job. And then we'll basically spend the rest of the day in the market garden. Market gardens take a lot of hours, so that makes up the majority of the workload here. So the gardens here are no-dig setup, so we put wood chip down between our beds, and big load of compost in the beginning. These beds are built straight on top of pasture with perennial weeds and things. We do no-dig because it leads to less weeds, less watered, and using this wood chip for pathways, it actually helps us soak up excess water. And what we find is that means you're walking around in a clean garden. It means we minimize washing of veg, like salad mixes that we cut with the greens harvester. We don't need to wash them because there's no dirt bouncing up on the leaves. And anytime we can minimize washing, we're maximizing shelf life. And it's part of a marketing thing too. Like, our farm looks beautiful and it's presentable, and it's the first thing a customer sees when they come into the farm. We are driving a very high level of economy in a very small space, in a very short growing season, in the middle of nowhere. So we managed to shift about €250,000 products in a 6-month production, which we then sell throughout the year, like meat products and eggs. We're able to turn over the value, more than the value of the farm and the investments we put in the farm every single 6-month season that we run. Having a broad product portfolio really helps. Like, when we have fresh chickens for sale in the summer, it's much easier to sell vegetables. I remember those words of Joel Salatin: it's much easier to find 100 customers that will spend $1,000 with you than to find 1,000 customers that will spend $100. And that's certainly my experience of running a mixed, diverse farm. We grow mesclun mix, spicy Asian greens and arugula. It's one of the most profitable crops we grow. On a little 10-meter long bed that's 30 inches wide, we're getting 40 kilos in 42 days. So that's a net of about 500 euros on a tiny little bed, and that used to be painstaking work. We would cut it with little serrated knives on the hands and knees, and that takes 25 minutes to do well, and what we found with the greens harvesters, that takes about 2 minutes flat. That's definitely a game changer for anyone growing greens or microgreens at any kind of scale. I'm really inspired to spend time in nature watching the ecosystem here develop. I'm totally motivated by feeding my family amazing food. That's why I wanted to build a farm. I decided that at about 15 years of age. I knew I wanted to bring up kids and raise a family around amazing food. We've become a little island that nature's moving back into because we're not sprayed and we're not bare ground. We're creating a habitat whilst producing amazing, diverse food, and that inspires me a lot when I wake up every day.
Let's just kick off with really some more general discussion with regards to regenerative agriculture. I think everyone by now, oh, by the way, I have to remind you of using the Q&A button. If you have your camera on, you can also wave to give me a sign that you basically want to jump right into the discussion. So we're planning to have this as an open discussion. So whenever you feel like asking something or saying something, just write it in the comments or give us a wave. Anyway, but so not only because of the recent movies like Kiss the Ground and Big Little Farm and so forth, the topic of regenerative agriculture has had such an incredible development and hype maybe also. So just to bring it together, what is your kind of, let's say, understanding or your own personal definition when you talk or think regenerative agriculture?
Sure. Well, that's something I've taken the liberty to define in my own terms, having written a book called Regenerative Agriculture, which I did very purposefully because I felt like the big ag industry has started to co-opt the word regenerative, and a lot of that is greenwash. And I feel like there was no one in the field of alternative, regenerative, organic agriculture, let's say, who was going to write that book in the near future. So I felt brash enough to do that, and therefore needed to determine what I considered regenerative agriculture. Because if you speak to different people within the movement, they will define it quite differently. And I think there's a lot of politics within any movement, obviously. And certainly my journey through the permaculture world and through the alternative agriculture scene, there's a lot of politics and people battling for their identity or their foothold in something that I've never really appreciated or been part of. It's like I'm into designing farms. I have some skills in that, and I don't care for so much of the movement. It's, movements are limited in their scope as far as I'm concerned. So for me, regenerative agriculture at its very basis, by any definition, has got to be soil building, because most agriculture on the planet is soil degrading. And if you look back at written history, then you see that every culture on earth that degraded its soil resource is now extinct. And we're able to move soil around faster and faster through bigger and bigger machineries in our debt-based, capital-based, oil-based agriculture. And we're moving around more soil today than we move more soil around every year through agriculture, every single year, than the last ice age moved in its entirety. And when you really sit back and look at the world out there, I mean, that's a crazy figure. We're moving more soil every year through agriculture than the last ice age moved in its entirety. And what happens when you damage the soil through tillage and leaving soil bare, which you don't see in nature? In nature, nature's covering up bare ground straight away, right? There is no such thing as bare soil unless there's been a catastrophe like a fire, a flood, or something like this. What happens when you expose soil to the atmosphere is the carbon in the soil oxidizes with oxygen in the atmosphere, and that flies off into the atmosphere as CO2. And that's one of our biggest problems on Earth today is bare soil. Like, we have more at stake through bare soil than any other of the problems that you hear about in your news feed.
Absolutely. I mean, and sorry, So while we're there covering the soil, do you want to make a little a shout out to the role of the cow? Because obviously that is always a very emotional topic, and I think in the group is a lot of people who appreciate the role of the cow. But to hear from your perspective, can you shed some light, maybe also regarding the water cycle, why it's the how and not the cow?
Sure, but let's get to that, because I feel like that's part of the politics too, and I'm interested in that, but that's only a partial part of the picture. I just want to first frame why carbon is so central and why I think anyone would agree that carbon is central to what we've defined as regenerative agriculture, in that carbon is what drives the soil food web. So we all know if we take a microscope and look down at the soil, we'll find groups of different organisms that really drive the fertility cycles in soil. And it's carbon that starts those the trophic pyramids we learn about in school. It's carbon that supplies the initial food source to that soil trophic pyramid. And it's carbon that actually buffers the pH of the soil. So if your soil is more alkaline or more acidic, by adding organic matter, you bring it back to neutral, which contains the region that plants all grow in. So it's also dealing with compaction. Like, anyone that's walked through an old forest will know, like, the spongy floor of a forest is bouncy. You can't compact it. Whereas if you go to most agricultural fields today that have been plowed up year on year, you have compaction in your soil. Like, soil has got no porosity in it, so water doesn't flow through it properly, and air and gas doesn't flow through it properly. So carbon deals with that too. And perhaps the most important thing that carbon does for our topsoils is that it holds water. So one particle of humus in the soil holds 4 particles of water to it. And that means that if we start increasing our soil carbon amount by a tiny amount, we start actually capturing and storing masses of CO2 from the atmosphere back into the soil where it's needed for plants. And it's the exact correct place for that to be. So we live in this world where we've got some of the smartest brains on the planet, people at MIT, people at our highest institutions, using or trying to find solutions to use technology to deal with carbon in the atmosphere, which is like smashing yourself on the head with a hammer and taking paracetamol to deal with the symptom. And that's how we deal with our education, our financial system, political system. We're fighting symptoms all the time. Most of that carbon came from topsoils, 9-meter deep, thick topsoils around Africa and America that are now places that are highly desertified. And we live in these lovely humid climates where we think desertification is over there somewhere, but it's actually happening all over the world. When you start to leave bare ground over such a large area of the earth, you start to create global changes in the weather, or global weirding, as you might call it, which we're starting to see affect agriculture more than any other industry on the planet, and that will only continue and become more erratic. And so carbon really is the basis. Like, I would list another 7 or 8 points that I think are important if we want to call agriculture regenerative, but I think the one that we can all agree on is that default baseline that it must be soil building, because we know historically every culture that damaged soil is now depleted, and we're able to do that faster and faster. And so what is the quickest way to take carbon out of the atmosphere and put it into our soils? Well, the fastest way possible, the most efficient way possible, is to capture sunlight and these fleeting photons that are zipping around the place, to catch them into grasslands and turn them into flesh. Like all flesh is made of grass. And so there is a very strong role for herbivores and for the meat and dairy industry in properly managed agriculture. Now, I've been a big proponent of meat and dairy and these kind of things, because if you're looking at Facebook feeds and you've got the attention span of the average modern human, which is just less than about 3 minutes nowadays, then you could be forgiven for thinking that meat production bad, vegetable production good. Right? But this is the complete, and that's true of modern conventional agriculture, correct? But it's the total opposite of what we would define as regenerative agriculture. Actually, vegetable production requires huge amounts of inputs from other farms to produce something that's fairly unnutritious and is exported off farm. There's nothing more simple than turning sunlight to grass to flesh and exporting nothing but bone off a farm. So we have a saying in our farming practices: you shouldn't let anything off the farm that can't walk or fly off on its own. Right? And that's a good practice to farm by. Right now, you can buy people's manure, you can buy hay, you can buy straw. Pretty much any European country, you can find those things very easily. But I predict that even in our own lifetimes, there will be a time you can't buy those resources, because people cannot afford to be selling their fertility out their front gate, as it were. So in that respect, I think it's true to say that herbivores and grassland management is extremely important for our future. However, I also want to point out, in defense of agriculture as a whole, is that that's only a small part of farming. And I think that's where the politics gets a bit skewed within the agriculture movement, is if you talk to the holistic management and the grazing people, they want to kind of say, hey, regenerative agriculture is our thing, and this is the only really regenerative thing, and all that stuff doesn't count fully, or whatever, and I don't buy that. It's like we need the whole world acting for the benefit of the whole. This is how nature functions. If we look at any organism in the natural world, we see that it's taking care of its own needs in the service of the whole ecosystem, and everything is patterned by default to act that way. And so that's what we need our societies and culture to look like. We need you as a beef farmer doing that. We need me as a veg farmer doing that. We need our bankers, our whatever, everyone in their roles and places powering up and being of benefit to the whole. And that's the way we can look at it. We can't isolate farming down to one or two practices, because we eat a whole array of foods. So we need to find the correct ways to farm all of those different things, and do that in an ecosystemic way. And we already have all the answers to how to do that. We try and demonstrate a lot of that at our farm. And my job is connecting people to farms around the globe that are doing other things that we aren't doing. But we know that we already have solutions to all of it. We just need many more people out there in the field doing it and empowering others to do it as well locally.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think with regards to us humans as an organism, I think we're by far the worst or the least well constructed being, because it doesn't matter in which side of area you look into, we just seem to like to self-destruct. And I think it's really interesting, like the description that you made of us being in those certain, in a certain, like, I'm doing this and that's the only, the holy grail, and the other people being in there. It doesn't really matter if you want to save the world or if you want to, take everything out of it. We all seem to get to those kind of ego stages where we seem to turn in our own little circles. And I think that's, for me, I always say we need more yin and less yang, but that's obviously very, very private thing. But with regard, you broke down the complexity of things quite nicely. But what you had been saying, if you look at the immense complexity, if you look at the immense differences in agricultural needs and situations all across the world, do you think everything that we now tend to believe, or that comes with that whole paradigm of regenerative agriculture, will save the world in that sense? Or how do you, let's say, how do you judge that hype that has recently been created around it?
Well, let's unpack that, because I mean, there's about 7 questions on 3 different levels in there, Benedikt.
You're an agriculture, you should be used to complexity, right?
Well, let me spin on that a bit then, because first and foremost, I can relate to what you're saying, but I don't agree with some of it. I don't think humans are a problem, and I don't think, I think it's extremely dangerous to go down the line of thinking that humans are a problem on the face of the earth. I think that's extremely nihilistic, and I don't buy it, and I'm not there, and I don't support it. I've studied ecology far too much for falling into that trap. I don't believe it. It's true. So that's my stance on that, and I feel like, it seems, I mean, I can relate and sympathize with that point of view, because there's a lot not going right, seemingly, especially if you live influenced heavily by the media rather than out in the field, moving sheep around, then you probably have quite a different view of the world. But I think it brings up something really valuable to talk about, which is that people have to understand that it's not about organic this, regenerative that. Like, people maybe, I'm just talking with my daughter who's just turned 10 now, and, they don't even study things like the Second World War in history at school anymore. When I was a kid, our grandparents told us about the Second World War in first person, right? So the world is changing fast. And I'm saying this because I think it's important to understand that just about 70 years ago, everything was organic, right? All food was organic, and all animals were raised on pasture all over the world. There was nothing different. So I think that's really crucial and critical for people to understand, because they're obviously not the answer to any of our problems, right? And this goes full cycle back to what you brought up, in that the thing that's been the problem is humans have not been able to make decisions in the face of complexity. Right. So let's define what that means. So in systems science, we have soft science, and we have soft systems and hard systems, complicated or complex systems, right? And a complicated system is like a telephone, a mobile telephone. We've all got one of these smartphones. It seems complex because you don't know what's going on with that, but this is just complicated technology. It's made up of all little circuits where this little thing, you press it, pop, and it goes ding, and that's all it does. And so what that means is, if you press dot and it doesn't go ding, someone that knows all about that circuitry can work out some pathway is broken, and they can fix it, and they can predict what the problem will be, and it can be solved, right? So that's a complicated system. You can diagnose problems and fix those systems. But the trouble is that when we're working with ecosystems, we're dealing with complexity, and complex systems differ on the most fundamental level in that they evolve in ways you can't predict. And so ecology does this. Economy does this, society does this. These are all the things that farmers automatically have to work with. And so this is a grave problem, because what we know, if we look historically, is that when we make decisions in the face of complexity, we usually come with a lot of hubris and assume that we know that we're right. And we make decisions and we try and sort of oppress the world around us because it's too far out to get our heads around. It's like, think about soil science. Until 50 years ago, soil science was, let's take living topsoil burn it to get rid of all the annoying living bits that move and run away and you can't study them, and then we'll look at what's left, and that's the basis of farming all over the world, right? So of course we've ended up with some pretty weird ideas. We've just tried to eliminate complexity out of our decision making. But what's interesting is when you make decisions in the face of complexity, unintended consequences are normal. Like that is the standard default thing that will happen, i.e. things will happen that you weren't able to predict. So what I'm referring to, and I think for me, I said the most default fundamental position of regenerative agriculture is that it must be soil building, or another way of saying that is it must be carbon sequestering. Well, the next most important point for me is it must be holistically managed. And what I mean by that is it must be using this set of decision-making matrices laid out by Alan Savory, who runs the Savory Institute and wrote the books called Holistic Management, a new decision-making framework. And what Alan Savory did is he realized, and if people aren't familiar with his work, I highly recommend they go and check this out, because it's one of the most important elements of regenerative agriculture in my mind, is a decision-making framework that allows us to account for complexity. And that's why my farm built up so quickly and has been so successful, is that we didn't spend any time sitting around trying to make decisions. We were crystal clear with what we were trying to do, and that's why we moved so quickly. Alan Savory took a planning, so he wanted to know, why have humans failed to make decisions in the face of complexity so long? And then he asked himself, well, who are the people that have to make the most intense decisions in the most complex scenarios? And so he went to the military planning techniques at Sandhurst, and he took military planning and adapted it for farming. Now that sounds all pretty full on and far out, but I would say that the holistic management decision-making framework is the single biggest part that I could share to be of benefit with other people. If people get clear about that bit, life gets very easy. Because something that will sound paradoxical perhaps to some listeners is that I'm not trying to fix the world. I'm not trying to save anything. I don't believe there's anything wrong, actually. And that might sound really paradoxical to some, but I believe that to be the truth. And so I'm not moved or steered by any of the hype, and I'm not personally invested in any of the hype. I know how to design farms that work, make money, and build soil, and feed amazing food to people. And I can tell people how to do that, and that's what I've dedicated my life to.
Right, I mean that's a good cause, I guess. But I mean, with regards to the potential that you obviously must see by thinking differently, by seeing differently, like planning differently, what you just figured out, you must have some sort of motivation to actually speak to a large community of people and say, look, this is a way that you can go. These are potential things that you can achieve. And that being said, if you, as you said, sort of dedicate your life to, I'm very sure that you probably do want to have that change. It's not just you being successful with what you do, right? I mean, so you must, I guess, I mean, I have certainly, but some feeling of saying, look, I can contribute, I want to contribute. Is that, I mean, you do so much with regards to education, you have your YouTube videos, you publish your second book. I mean, this must be a driving force, or am I understanding this not the right way?
I'm not totally sure where you understand it from, but my driving force is to just show up and contribute to the whole in a way that feels easeful and natural to me. And that looks like the books and videos and stuff I put out there. Yeah, I want to contribute to that, but I'm not motivated by trying to fix a problem. I'm motivated to share something I'm skillful at to be a benefit to the whole. That's all.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, looking at the whole, complex groups of individuals and initiatives and politicians and all the sort of interest groups, I mean, the question that we often get, or I think you probably often get, is also like, if the potential doing agriculture in a slightly different way is that big, why is not everyone doing it? And in that regard, what do you think is maybe the biggest one thing that keeps that transition from happening at this point?
I think I'm very clear what it is, but it's not one thing. One thing is fear, one thing is pride and arrogance, and the last major one is economy. So fear comes from institutions, and it's an institutional fear. I don't think it's individual fear. But if you look at the way institutions move, they're governed by public opinion, and they have been throughout history. That means if you go to agriculture school or any university for any subject pretty much on the planet, they're behind the leading edge of their field. For example, none of the best farmers that are practicing regenerative agriculture went to agriculture school. In fact, I think I'm the only one of the peers that I communicate with that actually went to ag school. And I left feeling like I had more questions than answers.
Right.
Like it was terrible, because sons and daughters of farmers, they study machine manuals, chemical application rates, and how to fill in subsidy forms. That's not farming, that's technician work, right? That's not farming at all. Farming is highly observational and skill-based, and it requires a lifetime of building up knowledge of when the stars are in this position over here, what does that mean? That means you have to bring certain crop in off the field. Like, you don't learn that in books. You know, you don't learn about the body condition of an animal through watching YouTube videos. Like, you learn it in the field by growing up around it. So this is the big problem of our institutions, is that they are behind the leading edges always, because that's the nature of how public opinion works. And it's why all governments and all institutions will fail in their missions, because they're not able to have a broad enough context for their decision making. Now, the other thing is pride and arrogance. You know, I used to do a lot of work in the south of Europe, down in Spain and Portugal, where desertification is very visible, very real. People will plow up and down hills with their lovely terracotta clays that make a audible note. Like, soil shouldn't make an audible note when you knock on it. and then when it rains, so first question is, why do farmers plow up and down hills? Well, because it's comfier to sit in a tractor flat than going around the slope. But that's a high school engineering problem. You know, a 10-year-old could work out how to engineer a seat to deal with that. But what happens when you plow up and down hills is that you make very fast pathways for rainfall to leave the land as an erosive force rather than regenerate and refill groundwater and bring the springs and rivers back. That's why in Spain and Portugal, whenever you go to the town square, there's a few old ladies sitting around reminiscing about when the spring used to flow, right? Because it's always dried up now. And then when it does rain, people don't go and look at the landscapes there, they go inside and drink wine or whatever. But I go out and look around the landscape, and always I see this red terracotta clay coming out with the rainfall out the farmer's front gate and off down the road. And it's so tragic, it's kind of funny. It's just so ironic. It's like the farmer's most precious resource, and his bank account is just running off outside this front gate. Why does he do that? Pride and arrogance. It's this hitting yourself on the head with a hammer and taking paracetamol. It's the same mentality. His grandfather did it like this. So that's how we do it, you know? That pride and arrogance is extremely hard to break, and it's particularly hard to break in the farming community, because we're a rugged, self-resilient people that never relied on the rest of society. We're the people that produce for society. So that pride and arrogance is even stronger than it is in any other sort of part of society. That's a big block and a big barrier. And so my work is, you know, I learned probably in my early 20s not to ever work with anyone who didn't come to me for the specific things that I can offer. Like, I'm not out to go change nothing. I'm not out to go convince anyone. I'm not trying to fix anything, because that's a crazy strategy. That's smashing your head against the wall, and soon you'll be taking aspirin to get rid of your headache.
Or wine. The wine helps also, obviously. I mean, no, I certainly agree, right? I think, you know, best thing you can do is be successful with what you do, and then I think everything else falls in line. But I mean, it's for me. I think it is like my personal strategy of health is also to focus on the things that we can change and that we can do, and not think about all the big other world problems that I can't solve myself anyway, right? But I mean, you have a weak moment and you still consider why certain things are the way they are, and for sure there's some things that could obviously be different. But I'd really be interested to hear your point of view, how sort of technology can, like, what kind of role technology can play in this regard. Because of course, I mean, there's every startup in this space is going to say, we're going to save this and that amount of inputs, and we can do this and that, and it's all good for the environment and the biodiversity. But really, I mean, how do you see the whole technological development with regards to land use?
Well, I think it's really a discussion about appropriate technology, isn't it? Because everything is technology. A wooden club is technology, just as much as the laptop you're sitting on right there, And I've kind of come through this alternative space with seeing a lot of troubled people who are anti-money or anti-technology. And it's like having heated debates on the internet about technology. It's like, hang on a minute, your head is not screwed on correctly. It's like, this is mindless thinking for me. It's not useful. Like, of course we need technology. It's amazing what capacities we have to hook up on the internet and share information at lightning speed. That's incredible. Yes, it comes at a cost, but everything we do comes at a cost, and it's incredible what benefit comes from it and how much has been influenced by it. I've seen our farm has influenced thousands of farms around the world. It's like, that does not happen if you didn't have a computer system and a video camera. And it's like, yeah, I'm really grateful for that. Sure, there's some negative impact of an internet, but like, hey, you all showed up here tonight, so what are we going to do? Sit around and lament about it, or are we going to use it for beneficial, creative purposes? And likewise, that's got to be applied to all technology, right? Like, yes, there's a place for robotic farm machines on big farms. Of course there is, but that's not my world. I'm into good hand tools and minimizing any technology just as a saving of cost. But I'm really into drones. The things that I can see on my farm with a drone that costs €1,000, it will blow you away, the decision-making that's influenced. The ability to be able to zoom into your farm from where I'm sitting right here in England, to zoom in and see your farm in Germany and be able to design a water system that will work by gravity forever. Hey, that's amazing. I've designed 5,000 to 10,000 hectare ranches on the other side of the world, sitting at a computer without going anywhere. In the past, I would have had to fly across multiple flights to get there and be paid stupid amounts every day for my services, in what I can now do in a few hours. It's amazing. Like the level of cartography. We've got LiDAR mapping down to 20 centimeter accuracy on a large proportion of the Western world now. And it's now possible to take my little €1,000 consumer drone and stick a LiDAR unit on that, and I can go to sub-Saharan Africa and map a 200-hectare farm and make a water system for a village for peanuts. It's amazing. So, yeah, we need technology. I'm sure there's technologies we don't need, but we're all choosing them every day, So we need to use them for benefit.
We have Jana, who has a question from the audience. Jana, do you want to ask maybe directly your question? If you unmute yourself. Otherwise, I can read it.
Try. I think my internet connection might be really bad.
Oh yeah, we know that feeling.
But I think one thing, and I think that's also one element I was just thinking about is kind of, it's the usual question of like who's in the room, who are we speaking to, who is the message of regenerative agriculture landing with, and do you think, like, are you reaching the people you want to reach? I'm pretty sure you understand what I mean, and you can maybe comment on that, like the question of audience and who should be hearing this message?
Do you want me to speak to that?
Please.
Well, I mean, my work's very specifically about technicalities of how to do the sorts of things that I've been proclaiming, I guess, for want of a better word, like small family farms that can make a decent white-collar salary for people, even in a rural environment. But I'm not trying to address big ag, and I'm not trying to address policy, and I'm not trying to address anything other than, hey, you want to make a living on a few thousand square meters or a 50-hectare farm? I can show you how, exactly how. Here's recipes and formulas that I can show you how to do that. That's my little world. I'm not out to speak to politicians or speak to people with tens of thousands of hectares that want to find smarter ways to deal with subsidies. I don't care. That's not my world. There's people that want to do that and they need to do that. Great. But I'm not concerned about that. I'm not trying to do anything. I'm just willing to show people if they're into the weird little bit that I'm doing. And so, yeah, I feel like I am reaching that audience because that audience is kind of looking for me, as it were. I'm not sort of trying to put myself out to the world. That world is coming to me, as it were. And I think that's been the evidence through our YouTube channel and our book. It's something that people are searching for. I remember when we published our book, all the major publishers wanted to publish that book, and they were like, well, we can get you in front of libraries and bookshops. And it's like, well, the people that want the sort of book I wrote are actively out of their way looking for it. They're not someone who's browsing through a library who's going to dedicate their life to small-scale farming. That's not how it works. So I think I am, but I don't know if Benedikt wants to speak, because...
Yeah, I wanted to ask Benedikt about that too, because I think you are also... You just started and you have a very diverse audience as well. And I was wondering what your answer also to this question is, especially because you also talk to like our agricultural minister. And I mean, are you over that now? Have you reached a point?
Every time I talk to her, I'm over it for a good couple of months, definitely. No, I mean, it's tough. To be honest with you, like, I absolutely, I can fully understand what Richard says. The thing is, I think Richard is so much further than we are at this point. So, I mean, he has his thing going on, he knows his routines, his numbers, his profitability and so forth. So he has done a lot of steps that we still are looking for, are still in the process of, right? So, and at this point, we are having to invest our own personal money into those projects. We have the highest risk possible at this point. We do things that are not allowed in the ecological, health, in any kind of regulation with regards of having animals and combining animals and slaughtering animals and all that products. All the kind of subsidies we cannot get because we are too sustainable, or we're too doing things that you're just not allowed to do, basically, right? So I think it is one of our roles to do all of that and take all of this hassle on us, because I think if you don't just do it, there is no basis of discussion, right? You have to create those examples in order to invite someone over, to show them. And once they see it, once they can experience it and touch it and feel it, then they're like, oh, wow, yeah, of course that makes sense. Yeah, let's talk about this. We have to put this into legislation or subsidy or whatever. So I think we're in very different places at this point. And as of now, I just think we have to convince everyone that we can possibly get.
Yeah, I wanted to add something, because like another dimension I could speak to that in is that, like, I totally agree that making those connections and networks is important, but it's really important to not feel like any actor within the movement has to do everything. A lot of people have pressured me in the past, well, you should do this, you should do that. And it's like, well, hang on a minute. It's like, I've done my bit. I've done enough, actually. Like, why didn't you go do that bit? Like, so I've been like quite defensive of my time in the last few years because I'm not as sprightly as I used to be. But what's interesting, and I just wanted to pick up on that, is that, for example, I know in Germany you've got some pretty horrendous legislation that's like the regulations make it very constrictive for innovations like we put forth in our book and stuff. And I've been on a tour, the Farm Like a Hero tour, all summer, interviewing farmers all over Europe who are coming into this space and starting up amazing businesses. And two things to point out is, one, there are people who already work in that at that level of having discussions with the right people who, once you've got your model up and running and in place, they'll come to you. So it's kind of like relaxing into things of like, hey, build it and they'll come. That's true. It's like, you don't need to go out of your way to go find those legislators. It's like the right people will come and connect you together when it's time. There's something about having trust in that process. It's like, you don't need to effort for those things, because the best things happen when there is no effort. That's, maybe sounds a bit fluffy, but there's truth in that. The other is that we just had a training at our farm at the end of the summer where we had many, many egg producers come to our farm who have copied our style eggmobiles that have, been copied all over the world now. And what's interesting to me is that the Swedish legislation has changed this year to accommodate basically what we started, because it's obvious that legislation is written for industry. It's not written for small-scale innovative farmers. And so the whole law of our country has changed basically because some English dude turned up and started doing something who couldn't even read the regulations, and other people started copying it. So national regulation is changing just because of doing it. And it's like, yeah, that's going to start happening more and more and more. And I know it's going to be happening in Germany a lot, because I know personally so many people there doing awesome stuff who are finding wiggle ways around it, So...
Can you give some examples of what the hurdles are, so people, because I didn't know it before, and there's some, I think it's interesting to hear what the problems of working in a sustainable way are.
Well, it would need unpacking in much more detail. But for example, there are cases I've documented on YouTube. Our friend Jasper has had some issues with eggmobiles copied a bit from ours. Because of EU regulations that, like in Sweden, we have EU regulations, but then we have Swedish regulations on top of them, which are usually for higher welfare standards than European standards. But we're not organic certified, so we can do things at our farm that are not possible in different other countries in Europe. So Jasper copied a bit of our eggmobile, and then the inspectors came and they didn't like certain bits, but he just found little tweaks that then, something worth saying is that meeting with regulators is a conversation, and it's an ongoing conversation. Like at our farm, we built a small low-cost slaughterhouse for our poultry production, and it's Europe's lowest certified approved slaughter facility. When we read the regulation, we had no idea what it actually meant. And when the regulators came to inspect it, they really had no idea what it meant, because it's written in a way that it can be interpreted individually. And that means that you might come as my inspector and say, okay, this looks good, you seem to know what you're doing, off you go. And then you go and start a job somewhere else, and a new inspector comes, and they might say, no, this isn't good enough, you have to change this, this, and this. So in this way, it's an ongoing dance, and it's there for the benefit of everyone to make sure food is safe, etc. And so that's the way that we have to approach these things, because even at this training at our farm I was talking about, we had 7 different egg producers using our style eggmobiles in Sweden who had all been told totally different things by their inspectors. And so it's like, well, how do you deal with this? You have to kind of stick your neck out and deal with it on your own also, and then be willing to share and talk about your experience. And that's where video and things like this are transforming the world, because once you now start up and you can point your inspector to my video where I detailed it really clearly with a video and you can see, it just makes it easier and easier and snowballs out like that. Another example in Germany has been like the no-dig way that we run our market gardens, which is rather than digging the soil, we're just putting a lot of compost on the surface, which try to imitate a higher ecological way to do vegetable production. And in Germany, I know you have really tight regulations on the amount of compost you can put down on a small space. But we're only doing that once to kill off weeds, and then the level of compost we put down is much lower in the future, and we basically put hardly anything on nowadays after a few years. The way that our friends have got around that is just tell the authorities they're putting a much higher amount, they're putting that amount over a much bigger area of their land. Because the authorities don't know, like they don't know how many chickens are in this structure. They don't know how much compost you put on your ground. They have no idea. They don't measure those things. But what's important is that we're not trying to do things to cheat the system. We're doing everything with utmost respect and care for the ecology. And the reason that law exists, or the regulation exists, is that they don't want nitrate runoff into the water systems. But what we see if we look at science is when we put our focus on healthy soil, is that there's one farm people could look up is Singing Frogs in California. It's one of the biggest no-dig farms that puts 60 tons per acre. So that's 150 tons per hectare of compost on their ground. The FDA in America came to shut them down and said you'll have way too high nitrate runoff in your waterways. They had cleaner runoff water from their farm than any other farm in California. Right? Because all that nitrogen is there in the bodies of living organisms in the topsoil, waiting to be taken up by plants as food in the way that nature intended. So we've got this whole advantage in this regenerative ag space in that we study how nature actually works and we apply that to leverage our production systems. And so what that means, and my experience with talking with regulators, is you can usually run rings around them if you know what you're doing, because their job is to know that you know what you're talking about. So if you really have studied up and you know more about it than they do, they're going to approve what you do. And that's been my experience with all the innovations that we've done. Yeah.
I mean, I think that's a really valuable, comment. I think that can work in pretty much every space, right? Just no more than the other one around you. I guess because I mean, Richard, you've always been also like an inspiration for many young farmers wanting to get into the space, and of course it's daunting because it's incredibly complex. You have a lot of barriers to entry, you have costs, you have land, you have so many basically things to consider. Is there any easy, let's say, tip where you say this is how you can start, or even put it differently, if you, with all the experience that you have today, would speak to your younger self when you started, what would you tell yourself in basically just before starting?
There's a lot of different tacks you could take on that, but I think that I think the most important thing for someone who wants to get into the space, and bear in mind that I've worked a lot in education, and I've done that since, over half my life now. And I've been doing intensive education. And what I notice is that the people coming into this space who have the most promise are not from farming backgrounds. Now, that also creates the most steep learning curves imaginable, because running any business is difficult. Like 95% of small businesses fail in any form. So there's not even any data on how many small agricultural businesses fail. But that's a steep learning curve. Learning how to run your own business is tough. But learning to farm is about as complex a business as you could ever possibly run. So learning both at the same time with no experience is really steep and tough. And it's doable, and a lot of our past students and interns have gone off and I think doing a better job than we ever did, and that's the aim. But I think the most important thing that anyone could do is go spend a season working at somewhere doing the thing that they want to actually do. if you want to grow veg, go find the best veg grower in your country or your climate zone and go graft and put a year into learning everything. It will save you tens of thousands of euros of time and money and wasted effort. And that's, I could say much more about the subject, but I think that's the most valuable thing that anyone could do, because ag school isn't going to teach you anything useful. So the only place to learn it is someone out there who's gone a few years further down the road than you have.
Maybe as a last question, or like also for everyone listening, and also for both of you, like, who are the people that you learn from? Is there any more resources that you can recommend where people can learn more about it, obviously, besides your YouTube channel? But like, are there any more other people that are pioneers and that have already done the work that share their knowledge?
Totally. I mean, there's a lot. I think, like, my design career, I spent most of my career designing properties of all scales, up to big industrial farms working in industry. And for design, my work was heavily influenced by Darren Doherty in my early career, because I kind of built a design career where there was no pathway. And I think Darren Doherty of Agrarians was very influential when I was in my early 20s and shaped my pathway. Alan Savory's work with holistic management has been a huge influence. Pierre Yeoman's work with keyline design is one of the biggest influences of design work that we have today. His books are available on soilandhealth.org, which is a free, out-of-date agriculture and health library. Out of print books, sorry. So you find a lot of amazing old agriculture books on there. Then I think grazing, some of the best grazers today, people like Greg Judy and Gabe Brown. You have the pioneering market gardeners like Elliot Coleman, whose work was taken on by Jean-Martin Fortier. And yeah, there's a whole sleuth of people doing amazing work all over the world, and you can find loads of information for free online. There's amazing books. It's pretty easy to find that information. Reading resources I have on our website, richdalepermaculture.com. There's a short reading list. I think in the back of our book there's a reading list. And yeah, there's a lot of resources online, and if you look at some of those people I mentioned, they probably have reading lists on their websites. And there's a lifetime's worth of reading to do in these fields.
Benedikt, how did you learn everything that you're doing right now?
I don't know much, to be honest with you. With every day experiencing outside, I realized that I know lesser than I already thought, which wasn't much to begin with. But I mean, obviously Richard's book, by the way, guys, Richard had a second book come out. I can highly recommend it. But I mean, to be honest with you, I think, as far as literature is concerned and all the pioneers and people, I think, they are very much around, and you can find them, I guess, online and check out Richard's side, of course. But I think, nothing beats just going out and doing it and volunteering or being an intern and just getting your hands dirty, and it doesn't even have to be perfect. You don't have to find the visionary in this or that thing. It's really about your own personal journey and see if you have the fire, because that's what you need in the end of the day if you want to get active as a farmer. And if not, then you don't have to, because I think this is what Richard said early on, and I think this is so incremental about this whole idea and movement. Like, you can do so much out of your way and out of your area where you're already active and you already have a network. You already know what kind of things you can do and you can't do, right? So we don't all have to do the same thing, right? So I think, really be interested, go out, speak to farmers, and plant a couple of trees or work with them and help them. And I think that's probably the best start that you can, and the best learner that you can get.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much. Being mindful of your time. I know that time is precious, especially for farmers. I would like to close our little conversation, but there's so much more to talk about. And as you guys said, it's the best to also just go out in the field. I hope next year we can do that again, either with our symposium or we also organize some farm visits around Berlin regularly. So yeah, you can inform yourself on that. We're doing a little Corona winter break right now, but we're sure we'll also meet Benedikt once, maybe next year. So thanks for joining, everyone. If you have any more questions, if you want to continue discussing the topic, we're also super happy to learn from you and the audience, like what are your most interesting topics that you want to know more about, then join our little Stammtisch, which is a little Slack channel, and you can join on our website, just search for Stammtisch and you can join that. So happy to see you there, and then hopefully see you for the next talks, which will be on the 3rd of November, I think. We will talk about migration and food culture, and also we will talk with Niels Yard Dairy about how to support cheese farmers and how they saved kind of British cheeses. So we can probably, in German you say, cut ourselves a slice off of that, a slice of cheese. Oh God, Jesus, okay, sorry. Bad fun. Okay, I'm going to stop talking now. Have a nice evening, guys, and I see you next time. Thank you, Benedikt and Richard, for taking the time, and I hope to see you and hear you soon and speak soon. Bye, everyone.